what I believe my oath and the Constitution demands of me for the sake of a partisan end, it would, I fear, expose my character to history's rebuke and the censure of my own conscience. I'm aware that there are people in my party and in my state who will strenuously disapprove of my decision, and in some quarters I will be vehemently denounced. I'm sure to hear abuse from the president and his supporters. Does anyone seriously believe that I would consent to these consequences other than from an inescapable conviction that my oath before God demanded it of me? I sought to hear testimony from John Bolton, not only because I believed he could add context to the charges, but also because I hoped that what he might say could raise reasonable doubt and thus remove from me the awful obligation to vote for impeachment. Like each member of this deliberative body, I love our country. I believe that our Constitution was inspired by Providence. I'm convinced that freedom itself is dependent on the strength and vitality of our national character. As it is with each senator, my vote is an act of conviction. We've come to different conclusions, fellow senators, but I trust we have all followed the dictates of our conscience. I acknowledge that my verdict will not remove the president from office. The results of this Senate court will in fact be appealed to a higher court, the judgment of the American people. Voters will make the final decision, just as the president's lawyers have implored. My vote will likely be in the minority in the Senate. But irrespective of these things, with my vote, I will tell my children and their children that I did my duty to the best of my ability, believing that my country expected it of me. I will only be one name among many, no more, no less, to future generations of Americans who look at the record of this trial. They will note merely that I was among the senators who determined that what the president did was wrong, grievously wrong. We are all footnotes at best in the annals of history, but in the most powerful nation on earth, the nation conceived in liberty and justice, that distinction is enough for any citizen. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over the past few weeks, we've heard a lot of arguments, accusations, and anecdotes. Some very skilled speakers on both sides have presented their case both for and against impeachment. I listened intently, hour after hour, day after day, to the House managers and the president's lawyers. And the word that kept coming to me, that I kept writing down in my notes, was fairness. Because you see, here in America, you are innocent until proven guilty. As the president's defense team noted, at the foundation of those authentic forms of justice is fundamental fairness. It's playing by the rules. It's why we don't allow deflated footballs or stealing signs from the field. Rules are rules. They're there to be followed. You can create all the rhetorical imagery in the world, but without the facts to prove guilt, it doesn't mean a thing. They can say the president cannot be trusted, but without proving why he can't be trusted, their words are just empty political attacks. You can speak of David versus Goliath, but if you were the one trying to subvert the presumption of innocence, if you are the one to will facts into existence, you are not David. You have become Goliath. Our job here in the Senate is to ensure a fair trial based on the evidence gathered by the House. I've been accused, as have many of my colleagues, of not wanting that fair trial. The exact opposite is true. We have ensured a fair trial in the Senate after House Democrats abused historical precedents in their zeal to impeach a president they simply do not like. During prior impeachment proceedings in the last 50 years, lasting around 75 days or so in the House, the opposing party has allowed witnesses and the ability to cross-examine. This time, House Republicans were locked out of the first 71 of 78 days. Let me say that differently. The ability to cross-examine the witnesses that are coming before the House against the president, the House Republicans were not allowed. The president's team was not allowed to cross-examine those witnesses. The ability to contradict and or to cross-examine or have a conversation about the evidence at the foundation of the trial, White House counsel, Republicans, not allowed. Think about the concept of due process. The House Republicans, the president's team, not allowed 71 of 78 days in the House. This is not a fair process. Does that sound fair to you? Democrats began talking about impeachment within months of President Trump's election and have made it clear that their number one goal, perhaps their only goal, has been to remove him from office. Does that sound fair to you? They've said, we're going to impeach, use an expletive. They've said, we have to impeach him, otherwise he's going to win the election. Now that might be the transparency we've been looking for in this process. The real root or the foundation of why we found ourselves here for 60 hours of testimony. It might be because, as they said themselves, if we don't impeach him, he might just win. What an amazing thought that the American people and not members of Congress would decide the presidency of the United States. What a novel concept that the House managers and Congress would not remove his name from the ballot in 2020, but we would allow the American people to decide the fate of this president and of the presidency. They don't get it. They don't understand that the American people should be and are the final arbiters of what happens. They want to make not only the president vulnerable, but they want to make Republican senators vulnerable so that they can control the majority in the United States Senate. Because the facts are not winning for them. The facts are winning for us. Because when you look at the facts, they're not their facts and our facts. They are just the facts. But what I've learned from watching the House managers, very convincing they were for the first day. And after that, what we realized was some facts mixed with a little fiction led to 100% deception. You cannot mix facts and fiction without having the premise of deceiving the American public. And that's what we saw here in our chambers. And why is that the case? Well, it's simple. When you look at the facts of this presidency, you come to a few conclusions that are, in fact, indisputable. One of those conclusions is that our economy is booming. And it's not simply booming from the top. It's actually, when you start looking into the crosstabs, as I like to say, what you find is that the bottom 20% are seeing increases that the top 20% are not seeing. So this economy is working for the most vulnerable Americans, and that's challenging to our friends on the other side. When you think about the fact that the Opportunity Zone legislation supported by this president is bringing $67 billion of private sector dollars into the most vulnerable communities, that is challenging to the other side. But those two are facts. When you think about the essence of criminal justice reform and making communities safer and having a fairer justice system for those who are incarcerated, that is challenging to the other side. But it is indeed a fact driven home by the Republican Party and President Donald John Trump. And these facts do have consequences, just like elections. And our friends on the other side, unfortunately, decided that if they could not beat them at the poll, give Congress an opportunity to, in fact, impeach the president. My friends on the left simply don't want a fair process. This process has lacked fairness. Instead, they paint their efforts as fighting on behalf of democracy when in fact they are just working on behalf of Democrats. That's not fair. It's not what the American people deserve. House managers said over and over again, the Senate had to protect our nation's free and fair elections, but they are seeking to overturn a fairly won election with absurd charges. The House manager said over and over again that the Senate has to allow new witnesses so as to make the Senate trial fair. But they didn't bother with the notion of fairness when they were in charge in the House. Their notion of fairness is to give the prosecution do-overs and extra latitude, but not the defendant. Actions speak louder than words, and Democrat actions have said all we need to hear. Let's vote no on these motions today and get back to working for the American people.
Senator from Maryland, Delaware, sorry.
Mr. President, the last time this body, the last time the Senate debated the fate of a presidency in the context of impeachment, the legendary senator from West Virginia, Robert Byrd, rose and said, "I think my country sinks beneath the yoke. It weeps, it bleeds, and each new day a gash is added to her wounds." Our country today, as then, is in pain. We are deeply divided. And most days, it seems to me that we here are the ones wielding the shiv, not the salve. The founders gave this Senate the sole power to try impeachment because, as Alexander Hamilton wrote, where else than in the Senate could have been found a tribunal sufficiently dignified or sufficiently independent? I wish I could say with confidence that we here have lived up to the faith our founders entrusted in us. Unfortunately, I fear in this impeachment trial, the Senate has failed, an historic test of our ability to put country over party. Foreign interference in our democracy has posed a grave threat to our nation since its very founding. James Madison wrote that impeachment was an indispensable check against a president who would betray his trust to foreign powers. The threat of foreign interference remains grave and real to this day. It is indisputable that Russia attacked our 2016 election, interfered in it broadly, and President Trump's own FBI director and director of national intelligence have warned us they are intent on interfering in our election this coming fall. So to my Republican colleagues, I have frankly found it difficult to understand why you would continue to so fervently support a president who has repeatedly and publicly invited foreign interference in our elections. During his 2016 campaign, Donald Trump looked straight into the cameras at a press conference and said, and I quote, "Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find Secretary Clinton's 30,000 emails." We now know with certainty that Russian military intelligence hackers first attempted to break into Secretary Clinton's office servers for the first time that very day. Throughout his campaign, President Trump praised the publication of emails that Russian hackers had stolen from his political opponent, and he mercilessly attacked former FBI Director Robert Mueller throughout his investigation into the 2016 election and allegations of Russian interference. Now we know, following this trial, that the day after Special Counsel Mueller testified about his investigation to this Congress, President Trump, on a phone call with the president of Ukraine, asked for a favor. He asked President Zelensky to announce an investigation of his chief political rival, former Vice President Joe Biden. And he asked for an investigation into a Russian conspiracy theory about that DNC server. In the weeks and the months since, he has repeated that Ukraine should investigate his political opponents and that China should as well. During the trial here, after the House managers and President's counsel made their presentation, senators had the opportunity to ask questions. I asked a question of the President's lawyers about a sentence in their own trial brief, one that stated, quote, "Congress has forbidden foreigners' involvement in American elections." I simply asked whether the President's own attorneys believe their client, President Trump, agrees with that statement, and they refused to confirm that he does. And how could they, when he has repeatedly invited and solicited foreign interference in our elections? So to my colleagues, do you doubt that President Trump did what he's accused of? Do you doubt he would do it again? Do you think for even one moment he would refuse the help of foreign agents to smear any one of us if he thought it was in his best political interests? And I have to ask, what becomes of our democracy when elections become a no-holds-barred blood sport, when our foreign adversaries become our allies, and when Americans of the opposing party become our enemies? Throughout this trial, I have listened to the arguments of the House managers prosecuting the case against President Trump and of the arguments of counsel defending the president. I engaged with colleagues on both sides of the aisle and listened to their positions. The President's counsel have warned us of danger in partisan impeachments. They've cautioned that abuse of power, the first article, is a difficult standard to define. They've expressed deep concern about an impeachment conducted on the brink of our next presidential election. I understand those concerns and even share some of them. The House managers, in turn, warned us that our president has demonstrated a perilous willingness to seek foreign interference in our elections and presented significant evidence that the president withheld foreign aid from a vulnerable ally not to serve our national interest, but to attack a political opponent. And they demonstrated the president has categorically obstructed congressional investigations to cover up his misconduct. These are serious dangers, too. We then are faced with a choice between serious and significant dangers. And after listening closely to the evidence, weighing the arguments, and reflecting on my constitutional responsibility and my oath to do impartial justice, I have decided today I will vote guilty on both articles. I recognize that many of my colleagues have made up their minds. No matter what decision you've reached, I think it is a sad day for our country. I myself have never been on a crusade to impeach Donald Trump, as has been alleged against all Democrats. I've sought ways to work across the aisle with his administration. But in the years that have followed his election, I've increasingly become convinced our president is not just unconventional, not just testing the boundaries of our norms and traditions. He is at times unmoored. Throughout this trial, I've heard from Delawareans who are frustrated the Senate refused to hear from witnesses or subpoena documents needed to uncover all the facts about the president's misconduct. I've heard from Delawareans who fear our president believes he's above the law and that he acts as if he is the law. I've also heard from Delawareans who just want us to find a way to work together. It is my sincere regret that with all the time we've spent together, we could not find common ground at all. From the opening resolution that set the procedures for trial, adopted on a party-line basis, Majority Leader refused all attempts to make this a more open, more fair process. Every Democrat was willing to have Chief Justice Roberts rule on motions to subpoena relevant witnesses and documents. Every member of the opposing party refused. We could not even forge a consensus to call a single witness who has said he has firsthand evidence, is willing to testify, and was even preparing to appear before us. Mr. President, when an impeachment trial becomes meaningless, we are damaged and weakened as a body, and our Constitution suffers in ways not easily repaired. We have a president who hasn't turned over a single scrap of paper in an impeachment investigation, unlike Presidents Nixon and Clinton before him, who directed their senior advisors and cabinet officials to cooperate. President Trump stonewalled every step of this Congress's impeachment inquiry and then personally attacked those who cooperated. The people who testified to the House of Representatives in spite of the president's orders are dedicated public servants and deserve our thanks, not condemnation. Where do we go from here? Well, after President Clinton's impeachment trial, he said, and I quote, "This can be and must be a time of reconciliation and renewal for our country," and he apologized for the harm he'd done to our nation. When President Nixon announced his resignation, he said, "The first essential is to begin healing the wounds of this nation." I wish President Trump would use this moment to bring our country together, to assure us he would work to make the 2020 election a fair contest, that he would tell Russia and China to stay out of our elections, that he would tell the American people, whomever his opponent might be, the fight will be between candidates, not families, and that if he loses, he will leave peacefully in a dignified manner, and that if he wins, he will work tirelessly to be the president for all people. But at this point, some might suggest it would be hopelessly naive to expect of President Trump that he would apologize or strive to heal our country or do the important work of safeguarding our next election, and so that falls to us, to my colleagues who've concluded impeachment is too heavy a hammer to wield. If you believe the American people should decide the fate of this president in the next election, what will you do to protect our democracy? What will you do to ensure the American people learn the truth of what happened so that they can cast informed votes? Will you co-sponsor bills to secure our elections? Will you insist they receive votes on this floor? Will you express support for the intelligence community that is working to keep our country safe? Will you ensure whistleblowers who expose corruption are protected, not vilified? Will you press this administration to cooperate with investigations, to allow meaningful accommodations so that Congress can have its power of oversight? Why can we not do this together? Each day of this trial, we said the Pledge of Allegiance to our common nation. For my Republican friends who've concluded the voters should decide President Trump's fate, we need to do more together to make that possible. And many of my Democratic friends I know are poised to do their very best to defeat President Trump at the ballot box. So here is my plea, that we would find ways to work together to defend our democracy and safeguard our next election. We have spent more time together here in the last few weeks than in the last few years. Imagine if we dedicated that same time to passing the dozens of bipartisan bills that have come over from the House that are waiting action. Imagine what we could accomplish for our states and our country if we actually tackled the challenges of affordable health care and ending the opioid crisis, of making our schools and communities safer and bridging our profound disagreements. What fills me with dread to my colleagues is that each day we come to this floor and talk past each other, not to each other, and fail to help our constituents. Let me close by paraphrasing our chaplain, Chaplain Black, whose daily prayers brought me great strength in recent weeks. May we work together to bring peace and unity. May we permit godliness to make us bold as lions. May we see a clear vision of our Lord's desires for our nation. And remember, we borrow our heartbeats from our Creator each day. Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent my statement be printed in the trial record.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over the last several months, last several weeks, the American people have watched Washington convulse in partisan accusations, investigations, and endless acrimony. That division reached its high watermark as the United States Senate carried out the third presidential impeachment trial in our nation's history. We saw over the last 2 weeks an impeachment process that included the testimony of 17 witnesses, more than 100 hours of testimony, and tens of thousands of pages of evidence, records, and documents, which I successfully fought to make part of the record. I fought hard to extend the duration of testimony to ensure that each side could be heard over 6 days instead of just 4. But what we did not see over the last 2 weeks was a conclusive reason to remove the President of the United States, an act which would nullify the 2016 election and rob roughly half the country of their preferred candidate for the 2020 election. House managers repeatedly stated that they had established overwhelming evidence and an airtight case to remove the president. Yet they also repeatedly claimed they needed additional investigation and testimony. A case cannot be both overwhelming and airtight and yet incomplete at the same time. That contradiction is not mere semantics. In their partisan race to impeach, the House failed to do the fundamental work required to prove its case, to meet the heavy burden. For the Senate to ignore this deficiency and conduct its own investigation would weaponize the impeachment power. A House majority could simply short-circuit an investigation, impeach, and demand the Senate complete the House's work, what they were asking us to do. The founders were concerned about this very point. Alexander Hamilton wrote regarding impeachments, and I quote, "There will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by real demonstrations of innocence or guilt." More recently, Congressman Jerry Nadler, one of the House managers in the trial, said, "There must never be a narrowly voted impeachment or an impeachment substantially supported by one of our major political parties and largely opposed by the other. Such an impeachment will lack legitimacy." Last March, Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, "Impeachment is so divisive to the country that unless there's something so compelling and overwhelming and bipartisan, I don't think we should go down that path because it divides the country." The framers knew that partisan impeachments could lead to impeachments over policy disagreements. Legal scholars like Charles Black have written that policy differences are not grounds for impeachment. But policy differences about corruption and the proper use of tax dollars are at the very heart of this impeachment. Nevertheless, that disagreement led the House to deploy this most serious of constitutional remedies. The reason the framers were concerned about partisan or policy impeachments was their concern for the American people. Removing a president disenfranchises the American people. For a Senate of only 100 people, to do that requires a genuine bipartisan national consensus. Here, especially only 9 months before an election, I cannot pretend the people will accept this body removing a president who received nearly 63 million votes without meeting that high burden. The House manager's other argument to remove the president, obstruction of Congress, is an affront to the Constitution. The framers created a system of government in which the legislative, executive, and judiciary are evenly balanced. The framers consciously diluted each branch's power, making all three separate but equal, empowered to check each other. The obstruction charge assumes the House is superior to the executive branch. In their zeal, the House managers would disempower the judiciary and demand that the House's interpretation of the sole power of impeachment be accepted by the Senate and the other branches without question. They claim no constitutional privilege exists to protect the executive branch against the legislature seeking impeachment. They go further and claim that a single justice exercising the Senate's sole power to try impeachments can actually strip the executive of its constitutional protections with a simple decree. In Federalist 78, Hamilton wrote, "Liberty can have nothing to fear from the judiciary alone, but would have everything to fear from its union with either of the other departments." If the House managers prevail, the House would have destroyed our constitutional balance, declaring itself the arbiter of constitutional rights, and conscripting the Chief Justice to do it. To be clear, the executive branch is not immune from legislative oversight or impeachment and trial, but that cannot come at the expense of constitutional rights, certainly not without input from the judiciary. After all, since Marbury versus Madison, it is emphatically the duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Without this separation, nothing stops the House from seeking privileged information under the guise of an impeachment inquiry. But the House managers say that no matter how flimsy the House's case, if the executive tries to protect that information constitutionally, that itself is an impeachable offense. That dangerous precedent would weaken the stability of government, constantly threatening the president with removal and setting the stage for a constitutional crisis without recourse to the courts. With this precedent set, the separation of powers would simply cease to exist. Over the 244 years history of our country, no president has been removed from office. The first presidential impeachment occurred in 1868. The next was more than 100 years later. Now, 50% of presidents have been impeached in the last 25 years alone. A tool so rarely used in the past is now being used more frequently. It's a dangerous development, and the Senate stands as the safeguard as passions grow even more heated. These defective articles and the defective process leading to them allow the House to muddy things and claim we're setting a destructive precedent for the future. Of course, bad cases make bad law. The House's decision to short-circuit the investigation, moving faster than any presidential impeachment over and a wholly partisan one at that, certainly makes for a bad case. So again, let me be clear about what this precedent does not do. At the outset, this case does not set the precedent that a president can do anything as long as he believes it to be in his electoral interests. I also reject the claim that impeachment requires criminal conduct. Rather, this shows first that House committees cannot simply assume the impeachment power to compel evidence without express authority from the full body and corresponding political accountability. Second, the House should work in good faith with the executive through the accommodation process. If that process reaches an impasse, the House should seek the assistance of the judicial branch before turning to impeachment. Finally, when articles of impeachment come to the Senate along partisan lines, when nearly half of the people appear unmoved and maintain adamant support for the president, and when the country is just months away from an election, in these circumstances, the American people would likely not accept removing the president, and the Senate can wisely decline to usurp the people's power to elect their own president. It has been said in this trial that the American people cannot make that decision for themselves. I couldn't disagree more. I believe in the American people. I believe in the power of our people to evaluate the president, to make their decision in November, and to move forward in our enduring effort to form a more perfect union. I do not believe a Senate nullification of 2 elections over defective impeachment articles is in the nation's best interest. So let's move forward with the people's business and bring this nation back together. Let's rise up together, not fight each other. Not all of us voted for President Trump. Not all of us voted for the last president or the one before him. Yet we should work to make our nation successful regardless of partisan passions. Passion positively placed will provide our nation with the prosperity it has always been blessed with. Partisan poison will prove devastating to our nation's long-term prosperity. We must not allow our fractures to destroy our national fabric or partisanship to destroy our friendships. If we come together, we will succeed together. For surely we are bound together in this, the great United States of America. Mr. President, I ask that this be included in the trial record and yield the floor.
Mr. President, today we face a crucial test, whether the Senate will rise to serve as a check on executive abuses that our founders expected it to be. But today and throughout this trial, I'm sad to say we're failing this test. After we've been confronted with overwhelming evidence of a brazen abuse of executive power, and an equally brazen attempt to keep that scheme hidden from Congress and the American people, the Senate is poised to look the other way, to pretend the Senate has no responsibility to reveal the president's misconduct and, God forbid, hold him to account. Instead, we are being told the Senate has no constitutional role to play. We're told only the American people should judge the president's misconduct in the next election. This, despite the fact the president's scheme was aimed at cheating in that very next election. And now the Senate is cementing a cover-up of the president's misconduct to keep its extent hidden from the American people. I've been here 45 years, and I think how far the Senate has fallen. In some ways, President Nixon's misconduct, directing a break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters to benefit himself politically, that seems quaint compared to today. As charged in Article 1, President Trump secretly directed a sweeping illegal scheme to withhold $400 million in military aid from an ally at war in order to extort that ally into announcing investigations of his political opponent in a way that would boost President Trump's reelection. And then, instead of hiding secret records, as President Nixon did, President Trump attempted to hide every single record from the American people. As reflected in Article 2, President Trump has the distinction of being the only president in our nation's history to direct all executive branch officials not to cooperate with a congressional investigation. So I want to be clear. I don't relish the prospect of an impeachment trial. I have stark disagreements with this president on issues of policy, on the law, on morality and honesty. But it's for the American people to judge a president on those matters. Today is not about policy differences. It's about the integrity of our elections and the Constitution. The Constitution cannot protect itself. We're supposed to protect it. The central arguments presented by the president's defense team were stunning, not unlike King Louis XIV of France, who famously declared, "I am the state." The president argues he can abuse his power to benefit his reelection so long as he believes his reelection is in the national interest. He even argues that he can request foreign governments to dig up dirt on political opponents with impunity. All of us in the Senate should flatly reject the president's argument, but an acquittal today will do just the opposite. If you believe that these outlandish arguments are irrelevant after today, remember this: the president's counsel's claim that abuse of power is not impeachable is largely and mistakenly based on the arguments of another counsel, Justice Benjamin Curtis, defending another president, President Johnson. That was 150 years ago. An acquittal today, despite the overwhelming evidence of guilt and following a sham of a trial, may fundamentally distort our systems and checks and balances for another 150 years. And what a sham trial it was. The fact that this body would not call a uniquely critical witness, John Bolton, or any other one, is beyond outrageous. And why? Is it because testimony detailing this corrupt scheme, no matter how damning, would not alter the majority leader's preordained acquittal? It's often said that history is watching. And I expect that's true, but this moment we're not merely witnesses to history, we're writing it. And let me describe the dark chapters we're inscribing in the story of our republic today. In his farewell address, George Washington warned us that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. Yet as a candidate, President Trump famously requested our foreign foe, Russia, to hack his political opponent's emails. And hours later, of course, Russia did. And literally the day after that saga finally came to a close, the president asked the Ukrainian president for, quote, a favor. He has since publicly repeated his request for Ukraine to interfere in our election. He made the same request to China. If we acquit President Trump today, what will he do tomorrow? Well, two things I'm confident of. President Trump's willingness to abuse his office, his eagerness to exploit foreign interference in our elections will only grow, and Congress's capacity to do anything about it will be crippled. While the president's lawyers stood on the Senate floor and admonished the House managers for failing to litigate each subpoena in court to exhaustion, he had other lawyers in court making the mutually exclusive argument that Article III courts have no jurisdiction to settle disputes between our two branches. Such duplicity would put the two-faced Roman God Janus to shame. But crucially, with this vote today, we inflict grave damage on our power of the purse. I see the chairman of the Appropriations Committee on the floor. I'm the vice chairman of Appropriations, and members of this committee are the guardians of this body's power of the purse, granted exclusively to Congress by the founders to counter all the overgrown prerogatives of the other branches. If we fail to hold President Trump accountable for illegally freezing military aid to extract a personal favor, what would stop any future president from holding any part of the $4.7 trillion budget hostage to their personal whims? And the answer is nothing. We will have relinquished the very check that the founders had trusted us to ensure the president could never behave like a king. Now, decades ago, I questioned whether impeachment would be accepted if not bipartisan. But the argument, the other side has revealed itself to be painfully flawed. In 1974, Republicans ultimately convinced President Nixon to resign. In 1999, Democrats condemned President Clinton's private misconduct and supported a censure. In contrast, with one Important exception, President Trump's supporters have thus far shown no limits in their tolerance of overwhelming misconduct. Before I close, I want to thank the brave individuals who shared their testimony with the House and American people. Each witness stepped forward despite knowing the disgraceful attacks they would endure, and we owe them our appreciation. They actually give us hope for tomorrow, but today's a dark day. And what frightens me most is this: we are currently on a dangerous road. No one knows where that road is going to take us. The notion that the president has learned his lesson is farcical. His lead counsel opened and closed the trial by claiming the president did nothing wrong. The president described his actions as perfect. On 75 separate occasions, including yesterday, he's claimed he's done nothing wrong. Well, Lord help us if the Senate agrees, because the only lesson the president has learned from this trial is how easily he can get away with egregious, illegal misconduct. The Senate does not recognize the gravity of President Trump's violation of the public trust, as Hamilton defined an impeachable offense, and vote to hold him accountable. We've only seen a preview of what will come: foreign interference in our elections, total noncompliance with congressional oversight, disregard of our constitutional power of the purse, open, flagrant corruption. That's the tragic result of the Senate failing in its constitutional duty. We'll leave President Trump sacred and inviolable, and with no constitutional tribunal to which he's amenable, no punishment to which he can be subjected without involving the crises of a national revolution. I quote Hamilton, and as Hamilton warned, that would not be a president, that would be a king. I'm proud to live in a country that likes presidents, not kings. And I, for one, will not merely get over it. President Trump directed the most impeachable, corrupt scheme by any president in this country's history. To protect our republic, to safeguard our system of checks and balances, my oath, which I take seriously, compels me to hold the President of the United States accountable. I will vote to convict and remove President Donald J. Trump from office. And Mr. President, before yielding the floor, I ask my full statement and my January 31 statement regarding the vote on witnesses be included in the trial record.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
The senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, over the past 2 weeks, my colleagues and I have patiently listened to arguments from both the House managers and the President's counsel right here in the Senate regarding a grave allegation from the House that the President has committed an act worthy of impeachment. As a senator, Mr. President, I believe that the first and perhaps most important consideration is whether abuse of power and obstruction of Congress are impeachable offenses, as asserted by our House managers. Impeachment is a necessary and essential component of our Constitution. It serves as an important check on civil officers who commit crimes against the United States. However, our founding fathers were wise to ensure that the impeachment and the conviction of a sitting president would not be of partisan intent. Since President Trump took office, many have sought to delegitimize his presidency with partisan attacks. We've heard this right here in the Senate, and we've experienced it. This extreme effort to unseat the president, I believe, is unjustified and intolerable. Now that the Senate has heard and studied the arguments from both sides, I believe the lack of merit in the House manager's case is evident. The outcome of the impeachment trial is a foregone conclusion. Acquittal is the judgment the Senate should and I believe will render, and soon. For my part, I have weighed the House manager's case and found it wanting in fundamental aspects. I will try to explain. I believe, Mr. President, that their case does not allege an impeachable offense. Even if the facts or, as they have stated, the managers have failed, I believe, as a matter of constitutional law to meet the exceedingly high bar for removal of the president as established by our founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution. In their wisdom, the framers rejected vague grounds for impeachment, offensive like we've heard here, maladministration, for fear that it would, in the words of Madison, result in a presidential tenure during the pleasure of the Senate. Abuse of power, one of the charges put forward here by the House managers, is a concept as vague and susceptible to abuse, I believe, as maladministration. If you take just a minute or two to look at the definitions of abuse and mal, they draw distinct similarities. Mal, a prefix of Latin origin, means bad, evil, wrong. Abuse, also of Latin origin, means to wrongly use or to use for a bad effect. There's a kinship between mal and abuse. As the framers rejected, in their wisdom, maladministration, I believe that they too would reject the non-criminal abuse of power. Instead, the framers, as the presiding officer knows, the framers provided for impeachment only in a few limited cases: treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. Only those offensive justify taking the dire step of removing a duly elected president from office and permanently taking his name off the ballot. This institution, the U.S. Senate, I believe, should not lower the constitutional bar and authorize their theory of impeachment for abuse of power. It's simply not an impeachable offense, in my judgment. Their criteria for removal centers not on the president's actions, but on their loose perception of his motivations. If the Senate endorses this approach, we will dramatically transform the impeachment power as we have known it over the years. We will forever turn this grave constitutional power into a tool for adjudicating policy disputes and political disagreements among all of us. The framers, in their wisdom, cautioned us against this dangerous path, and I believe the Senate will heed their warning. The other article, the House manager's obstruction of Congress claim, is similarly flawed. Congress's investigative and oversight powers are critical tools, and we use them in ensuring our system of checks and balances. But those powers are not absolute. The president, too, as head of a co-equal branch of government, enjoys certain privileges and immunities from congressional fact-finding. That is his constitutional right and has been the right of former presidents from both parties. The president's mere assertion of privileges and immunities is not impeachable. It's not an impeachable offense. Endorsing otherwise would be unprecedented and would ignore the past practices of administrations of both parties. Adopting otherwise would drastically undermine the separation of powers enshrined in our Constitution. This was not what our framers intended. Mr. President, nowhere in the Constitution, as you know, or in the federal statute is abuse of power or obstruction of Congress listed as a crime. Nowhere. What constitutes an impeachable offense is not left to the discretion of the Congress. We cannot expand, I believe, on the scope of actions that could be deemed impeachable beyond that which the framers intended. What we really have here, I believe, is nothing more than the abuse of the power of impeachment itself by the Democratic House. Doesn't our country deserve better? The president certainly deserves better. And today I'm proud to stand and repudiate those very weak impeachment efforts, and I will accordingly vote to acquit the president on both sides, both articles. Mr. President, my hope is that in the future Congress will reject this episode and instead choose to be guided by the Constitution and the words of our framers. Mr. President, basically I believe it's a time to move on. We know that the American economy is booming. The United States is projecting strength and promoting peace abroad, and the President is unbowed. And I believe the American people see all of this. At the end of the day, Mr. President, the ultimate judgment rests in their hands. In my judgment, that is just as it should be. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Assistant Democratic Leader.
Mr. President, Benjamin Franklin knew the strength of our Constitution, but he also knew its vulnerability. His words, oft repeated on this floor, "A republic, if you can keep it," were a stark warning. Franklin believed every generation could face the challenge of protecting and defending our nation's liberty-affirming document. We know this personally. Before we can legally serve as senators, we must publicly swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. A trial of impeachment, more than any other Senate assignment, tests the oath each one of us takes before the people of this nation. The President's legal team warns us of the danger of impeachment and conviction. They tell us to think carefully about what the removal of a duly elected president could mean for our democracy. But if we should have our eyes wide open to the danger of conviction, we also cannot ignore the danger of acquittal. The facts of this impeachment are well known, and many Republicans concede that they are likely true. They believe, as I do, that President Trump pressured the Ukrainian president by withholding vital military aid and a prized White House visit in return for the announcement of an investigation of the Bidens and the Russian-concocted CrowdStrike fantasy. Some of these same Republicans acknowledge that what the president did was inappropriate. At least one has used the word impeachable, but many say they're still going to vote to acquit him regardless. So let's open our eyes to the morning after a judgment of acquittal. Facing a well-established election siege by Russia and other enemies of the United States, we, the Senate, will have absolved a president who continues to brazenly invite foreign interference in our elections. Expect more of the same. A majority of this body will have voted for the president's argument that inviting interference by a foreign government is not impeachable if it serves the president's personal political interest. We will also have found for the first time in the history of this nation that an impeachment proceeding in the Senate can be conducted without any direct witnesses or evidence presented on either side of the case, and that a president facing impeachment can ignore subpoenas to produce documents or witnesses to Congress. Alexander Hamilton described the Senate as the very best venue for an impeachment trial because it is independent and dignified, in his words. When the Senate voted 51-49 against witnesses and evidence, those 51 raised into question any claim to independence or dignity. In addition, an acquittal will leave the extreme views stated by the President's defense counsel, Alan Dershowitz, unchallenged. First, that abuse of power is not an impeachable offense. Second, that the impeachment charges against the President were constitutionally insufficient. And third, his most dangerous theory, that unless the President has committed an actual crime, his conduct cannot be corrupt or impeachable as long as he believes it was necessary for his reelection. By this logic, Professor Dershowitz would have excused Richard Nixon's ordering of IRS audits of his political enemies. Mr. Dershowitz has created an escape clause to impeachment which is breathtaking in its impact and unfounded in our legal history. We've all received a letter signed by nearly 300 constitutional law scholars flatly rejecting the arguments offered by the President's defense team. I ask unanimous consent the scholar's letter be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Yet a verdict of acquittal by the Senate blesses the professor's tortuous reasoning. An acquittal verdict would also give President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, a pat on the back to continue his global escapades, harassing American ambassadors whose service he distrusts and lounging at European cigar bars with an entourage of post-Soviet amigos. More than anything, a verdict of acquittal says a majority of the Senate believes this president is above the law and cannot be held accountable for conduct abusing the powers of his office. And make no mistake, this president believes that's true. On July the 23rd, 2 days before his phone call with President Zelensky, President Trump spoke to a group of young supporters and he said, and I quote, "I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president." This is the dangerous principle that President Trump and his lawyers are asking us with a verdict of acquittal to accept. Under the oath I have sworn, I cannot. What does it say of this Congress and our nation that in 3 years we have become so anesthetized to outrage that for a majority in this Senate, there is nothing this president can do or say that rises to the level of blush-worthy, let alone impeachable? Nearly 6 years ago, I traveled to Ukraine with a bipartisan group of Senate colleagues led by John McCain. It was one of the John's whirlwind visits where we crammed 5 days' worth of meetings into 48 hours. We arrived in Kyiv on March 14, 2014. It was bitterly cold. Ukrainians had just ousted a corrupt, Russian-backed leader who looted the national treasury and hollowed out their nation's military. They'd done so by taking to the streets, risking their lives for democracy and a better future. More than 100 ordinary citizens in Kyiv had been killed by security forces of the old government simply because they were protesting for democracy. Seeing Ukraine in a fragile democratic transition, Vladimir Putin pounced on them, ordered an invasion, and occupied Crimea. Putin and his thinly disguised Russian thugs were on the verge of seizing Donetsk in the east. I asked the Prime Minister what Ukraine needed to defend itself. He said, "Everything. We don't have anything that floats, flies, or runs." Many may not appreciate how devastating Russia's war on Ukraine has been to that struggling young democracy. Their costly battle with Russia was for a principle that is really basic to America's national security as well. In a country with 1/8 of our population, more Ukrainian troops have died defending Ukraine from Russia than American troops have perished in Afghanistan. During the months President Trump illegally withheld military aid, as many as 24 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in battle. By withholding security aid from Ukraine for President Trump's personal political benefit, he endangered the security of a fragile democracy. Can there be any deeper betrayal of a president's responsibility than to endanger our national security and the security of an ally for his own personal political gain? And to those of my colleagues who describe the president's conduct as merely inappropriate, I disagree. Disparaging John McCain's service to our country is disgusting and inappropriate. What this president has done to Ukraine crosses that line. It is impeachable. I'll close by remembering two public servants who, like us, were called by history to judge a president. Tom Railsback passed away as this impeachment proceeding began. He was 2 days shy of his 88th birthday. I knew Tom. I considered him a friend. In 1974, Tom was a Republican congressman from Moline, Illinois, and a member of the House Judiciary Committee. He regarded President Nixon as a political friend. He believed that Richard Nixon had achieved much for America, including the opening of the door to China. After studying the Watergate evidence closely, Congressman Railsback came to believe that Richard Nixon had violated the Constitution. When President Nixon refused to turn over records and recordings requested by Congress, Tom Railsback took to the House floor to say, if the Congress doesn't get the material we think we need and then votes to exonerate, we'll be regarded as a paper tiger. When he voted to impeach President Nixon, Tom believed it was probably the end of his career, but he was elected 4 more times. To his dying day, Tom Railsback was proud of his vote. He voted for his country above his party. Bill Cohen, also a Republican, was a freshman congressman at the time and a member of the House Judiciary Committee. He studied the evidence with Tom Railsback and worked with him to draft articles of impeachment. Bill Cohen received death threats, and he thought his votes to impeach President Nixon would be the end of his political career. But he went on to a distinguished career in the House, 3 terms in the Senate, and served as Secretary of Defense. Listen to what Bill Cohen said recently of President Trump's actions, and I quote, This is presidential conduct that you want to be ashamed of. He is corrupting institutions, politicizing the military, and acts like he is the law. And then Cohen added, if the president's conduct is acceptable, we really don't have a republic as we've known it anymore. May I respectfully say to my Senate colleagues, Ben Franklin warned us of this day. I will vote guilty on both articles of impeachment against President Donald John Trump, on Article 1, abuse of power, and Article 2, obstruction of Congress. But at this moment of high constitutional drama, I hope my last words can be a personal appeal to my Senate colleagues. Last night, many of us attended a State of the Union address which was as emotionally charged as any I have ever attended. As divided as our nation may be, and as divided as this Senate may be, we should remember America has weathered greater storms than this impeachment and our current political standoff. It was Abraham Lincoln, in the darkness of our worst storm, who called on us to, quote, strive on to finish the work we are in, to work to bind the nation's wounds. After this vote, and after this day, those of us who are entrusted with this high office must each do our part to work to bind the wounds of our divided nation. I hope we can leave this chamber with that common resolve. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Carolina.
I'd like unanimous consent to introduce my full statement after my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. So let me just begin with a note of optimism. You're going to get to pick the next president, not a bunch of politicians driven by sour grapes. And I don't say that lightly. I didn't vote for President Trump. I voted for somebody I wouldn't know if they walked in the door. But I accepted the fact that he won. That's been hard for a lot of people. I supported the Mueller investigation. I had Democratic colleagues come to me and say, we're afraid he's going to fire Mueller. Will you stand with us to make sure Mueller can complete his investigation? And I did. 2 years, $32 million, FBI agents, subpoenas, you name it. The verdict is in. What did we find? Nothing. I thought that would be it. But it's never enough when it comes to Trump. Sorry. It's never enough when it comes to President Trump. This sham process is the low point in the Senate for me. If you think you've done the country a good service by legitimizing this impeachment process, what you have done is unleash the partisan forces of hell. This is sour grapes. They impeached the President of the United States in 78 days. You could not get a parking ticket if you contested it in 78 days. They gave out souvenir pins when it was over. If you can't see through that, your hatred of Donald Trump has blinded you to the obvious. This is not about protecting the country. This is about destroying the president. There are no rules when it comes to Donald Trump. Everybody in America can confront the witnesses against them except Donald Trump. Everybody in America can call witnesses on their behalf except President Trump. Everybody in America can introduce evidence except for President Trump. He's not above the law, but you put him below the law. In the process of impeaching this president, you've made it almost impossible for future presidents to do their job. In 78 days, you took due process, as we've come to know it in America, and threw it in the garbage can. This is the first impeachment in the history of the country driven by politicians. The Nixon impeachment had outside counsel, Watergate prosecutors. The Clinton impeachment had Ken Starr, who looked at President Clinton for years before he brought it to Congress. The Mueller investigation went on for 2 years. I trusted Bob Mueller. And when he rendered his verdict, it broke your heart. And you can't let it go. The only way this is going to end
permanently is for the president to get reelected, and he will. So as to abuse of Congress, it is a wholesale assault on the presidency. It is abandoning every sense of fairness that every American has come to expect in their own lives. It's driven by blind partisanship and hatred of the man himself. And they wanted to do it in 78 days. Why? Because they wanted to impeach him before the election. I am not making this up. They said that. The reason the president never was allowed to go to court and challenge the subpoenas that were never issued is because the House managers understood it might take time. President Clinton and President Nixon were allowed to go to Article III court and contest the House's action. That was denied this president because it would get in the way of impeaching him before the election. And you send this crap over here, and you're okay with it, my Democratic colleagues. You're okay with the idea that the president was denied his day in court, and you were going to rule on executive privilege as a political body. You're willing to deal out the Article III courts because you hate Trump that much. What you've done is you've weakened the institution of the presidency. And be careful what you wish for, because it's going to come back your way. So abuse of Congress should be entitled Abuse of Power by the Congress. If you think Adam Schiff is trying to get to the truth, I got a bridge I want to sell you. These people hate Trump's guts. They rammed it through the House in a way you couldn't get a parking ticket, and they achieved their goal of impeaching him before the election. Well, the Senate's going to achieve its goal of acquitting him in February. And the American people are going to get to decide in November who they want to be their president. So acquittal will happen in about 2 hours. Exoneration comes when President Trump gets reelected, because the people of the United States are fed up with this crap. But the damage you have done will be long-lasting. Abuse of power. You're impeaching the President of the United States for suspending foreign aid for a short period of time that they eventually received ahead of schedule to leverage an investigation that never happened. You're going to remove the President of the United States for suspending foreign aid to leverage an investigation of a political opponent that never occurred. The Ukrainians did not know the suspension until September. They didn't feel any pressure. And if you're okay with Joe Biden and Hunter Biden doing what they did, it says more about you than it does anything else. The point of the abuse of power article is that you've made it almost impossible now for any president to pick up the phone if all of us can assume the worst and impeach somebody based on a subjective standard. He was talking about corruption in the Ukraine with a past president. And the Biden's conduct in the Ukraine undercut our ability to effectively deal with corruption by allowing his son to receive $3 million from the most corrupt gas company in the Ukraine. Can you imagine how the Ukrainian parliament must have felt to be lectured by Joe Biden about ending sweetheart deals? What you have done is impeach the President of the United States and willing to remove him because he suspended foreign aid for 40 days to leverage an investigation that never occurred. And to my good friend Dick Durbin, Donald Trump has done more to help the Ukrainian people than Barack Obama did in his entire 8 years. If you're looking for somebody to help the Ukrainian people fight the Russians, how about giving them some weapons? This is a sham. This is a farce. This is disgusting. This is an injustice to President Trump as a person. It's a threat to the office. It will end soon. It's going to be an overwhelming rejection of both articles. We're going to pick up the pieces and try to go forward, but I can say this without any hesitation. I worry about the future of the presidency after what's happened here. Ladies and gentlemen, you will come to regret this whole process. And to those who have these pens, I hope you will understand history will judge those pens as a souvenir of shame. I yield.
Mr. President.
The Democratic leader.
The articles of impeachment before us charged President Donald John Trump with offenses against the Constitution and the American people. The first article of impeachment charges that President Trump abused the office of the presidency by soliciting the interference of a foreign power, Ukraine, to benefit himself in the 2020 election. The president asked a foreign leader to do us a favor, us meaning him, and investigate his political opponents. In order to elicit these political investigations, President Trump withheld a White House meeting and hundreds of millions of dollars in military assistance from an ally at war with Russia. There's extensive documentation in the record proving this quid pro quo and the corrupt motive behind it. The facts are not seriously in dispute. In fact, several Republican senators admitted they believe the president committed this offense with varying degrees of opprobrium: inappropriate, wrong, shameful. Almost all Republicans will argue, however, that this reprehensible conduct does not rise to the level of an impeachable offense. The founders could not have been clearer. William Davey, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, deemed impeachment, quote, an essential security, lest the president, quote, spare no efforts or means whatever to get himself reelected. James Madison offered a specific list of impeachable offenses during the debate in Independence Hall. A president might lose his capacity or embezzle public funds. A despicable soul might succumb to bribes while in office. Madison then arrived at what he believed was the worst conduct a president could engage in. The president could betray his trust to foreign powers, which would be fatal to the republic. Madison's words. When I studied the Constitution and the Federalist Papers in high school, admittedly, I was skeptical of George Washington's warning that, quote, foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government, unquote. It seemed so far-fetched. Who would dare? But the foresight and wisdom of the founders endures. Madison was right. Washington was right. There is no greater subversion of our democracy than for powers outside of our borders to determine elections within them. If Americans believe that they don't determine their senator, their governor, their president, but rather some foreign potentate does, that's the beginning of the end of democracy. For a foreign country to attempt such a thing on its own is contemptible. For an American president to deliberately solicit such a thing, to blackmail a foreign country into helping him win an election, is unforgivable. Now, does this rise to the level of impeachable offense? Of course it does. Of course it does. The term high crimes derives from English law. Crimes were committed between subjects of the monarchy. High crimes were committed against the crown itself. The framers did not design a monarchy. They designed a democracy, a nation where the people were king. High crimes are those committed against the entire people of the United States. The president sought to cheat the people out of a free and fair election. How could such an offense not be deemed a high crime, a crime against the people? As one constitutional scholar in the House Judiciary hearings testified, if this is not impeachable, nothing is. I agree. I judge that President Trump is guilty of the first article of impeachment. The second article of impeachment is equally straightforward. Once the president realized he got caught, he tried to cover it up. The president asserted blanket immunity. He categorically defied congressional subpoenas, ordered his aides not to testify, and withheld the production of relevant documents. Even President Nixon, author of the most infamous presidential cover-up in history, permitted his aides to testify in Congress in the Watergate investigation. The idea that the Trump administration was properly invoking the various rights and privileges of the presidency is nonsense. At each stage of the House inquiry, the administration conjured up a different bad faith justification for evading accountability. There is no circumstance under which the administration would have complied. When I asked the President's counsel twice to name one document or one witness the President provided to Congress, they could not answer. It cannot be that the President, by dint of legal shamelessness, can escape scrutiny entirely. Once again, the facts are not in dispute, but some have sought to portray the second article of impeachment as somehow less important than the first. It is not. The second article of impeachment is necessary if Congress is to ever hold a president accountable again, Democrat or Republican. The consequences of sanctioning such categorical obstruction of Congress would be far-reaching, and they will be irreparable. I judge that President Trump is guilty of the second article of impeachment. The Senate should convict President Trump, remove him from the presidency, and disqualify him from holding future office. The guilt of the President on these charges is so obvious that here again, several Republican senators admit that the House has proved its case. So instead of maintaining the President's innocence, the President's counsel ultimately told the Senate that even if the President did what he was accused of, it's not impeachable. This has taken the form of an escalating series of Dershowitzian arguments, including, quote, abuse of power is not an impeachable offense, quote, the President can't be impeached for non-criminal conduct, but he also can't be indicted for criminal conduct. Quote, if a president believes his own re-election is essential to the nation, then a quid pro quo is not corrupt. These are the excuses of a child caught in a lie, each explanation more outlandish and desperate than the last. It would be laughable if not for the fact that the cumulative effect of these arguments would render not just this president, but all presidents immune from impeachment and therefore above the law. Now, several members of this chamber said that even if the president is guilty, and even if it's impeachable, the Senate still shouldn't convict the president because there's an election coming up. As if the framers forgot about elections when they wrote the impeachment clause. If the founders believed that even when a president is guilty of an impeachable offense, that the next election should decide his fate, they never would have included an impeachment clause in the Constitution. That much is obvious. Alone, each of the defenses advanced by the President's counsel comes close to being preposterous. Together, they are as dangerous to the Republic as this president, a fig leaf so large as to excuse any presidential misconduct. Unable to defend the president, arguments were found to make him a king. Let future generations know that only a fraction of the Senate swallowed these fantasies. The rest of us condemn them to the ash heap of history and the derision of first-year law students everywhere. We are only the third Senate in history to sit as a court of impeachment for the president. The task we were given was not easy, but the framers gave the Senate this responsibility because they could not imagine any other body capable of it. They considered others, but they entrusted us to us, and the Senate failed. The Republican caucus trained its outrage not on the conduct of the president, but on the impeachment process in the House, deriding falsely an alleged lack of fairness and thoroughness. The conjured outrage was so blinding that the Republican majority ended up guilty of the very sins it falsely accused the House of committing. It conducted the least fair, least thorough, most rushed impeachment trial in the history of this country. A simple majority of senators denied the Senate's right to examine relevant evidence, to call witnesses, to review documents, and to properly try the impeachment of the president, making this the first impeachment trial in history that heard from no witnesses. A simple majority of senators, in deference to, and most likely in fear of, the president of their party, perpetrated a great miscarriage of justice in the trial of President Trump. As a result, the verdict of this kangaroo court will be meaningless. By refusing the facts, by refusing witnesses and documents, the Republican majority has placed a giant asterisk, the asterisk of a sham trial, next to the acquittal of President Trump, written in permanent ink. Acquittal in an unfair trial with this giant asterisk, the asterisk of a sham trial, is worth nothing at all to President Trump or to anybody else. No doubt, the president will boast he received total exoneration, but we know better. We know this wasn't a trial by any stretch of the definition, and the American people know it too. We've heard a lot about the framers over the past several weeks, about the impeachment clause they forged, the separation of powers they wrought, the conduct they most feared in our chief magistrate. But there is something the founders considered even more fundamental to our republic: truth. The founders had seen and studied societies governed by the iron fist of tyrants and the divine right of kings, but none by argument, rational thinking, facts, debate. Hamilton said the American people would determine, quote, whether societies are really capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or forever destined to depend on accident and force. And what an astonishing thing the founders did. They placed a bet with long odds. They believed that reflection and choice would make us capable of self-government, that we wouldn't agree on everything, but at least we could agree on a common baseline of fact and of truth. They wrote a constitution with the remarkable idea that even the most powerful person in our country was not above the law and could be put on trial, a place where you seek truth. The faith our founders placed in us makes the failure of this Senate even more damning. Our nation was founded on the idea of truth, but there was no truth here. The Republican majority couldn't let truth into this trial. The Republican majority refused to get the evidence because they were afraid of what it might show. Our nation was founded on the idea of truth, but in order to countenance this president, you have to ignore the truth. Republicans walk through the halls with their heads down. They didn't see the tweet. They can't respond to everything he says. They hope he learned his lesson this time. Yes, maybe this time he learned his lesson. Our nation was founded on truth. But in order to excuse this president, you have to willfully ignore the truth and indulge in the president's conspiracy theories. Millions of people voted illegally. The deep state is out to get them. Ukraine interfered in our elections. You must attempt to normalize his behavior. Obama did it too, they falsely claim. Democrats are just as bad. Our nation was founded on the idea of truth. But this president is such a menace, so contemptuous of every virtue, so dishonorable, so dishonest, that you must ignore, indeed sacrifice, the truth to maintain his favor. The trial of this president, its failure, reflects the central challenge of this presidency and maybe the central challenge of this time in our democracy. You cannot be on the side of this president and be on the side of truth. And if we are to survive as a nation, we must choose truth. Because if the truth doesn't matter, if the news you don't like is fake, if cheating in an election is acceptable, if everyone is as wicked as the wickedest among us, then the hope for the future is lost. The eyes of the nation are upon this Senate, and what they see will strike doubt in the heart of even the most ardent patriot. The House managers established the president abused the great power of his office to try to cheat in an election, and the Senate majority is poised to look the other way. So I direct my final message, not to the House managers, not even to my fellow senators, but to the American people. My message is simple. Don't lose hope. There is justice in this world, and truth, and right. I believe that. I wouldn't be in this government if I didn't. Somehow, in ways we can't predict, with God's mysterious hand guiding us, truth and right will prevail. There have been dark periods in our history, but we always overcome. The Senate's opening prayer yesterday was Amos 5:24. Let justice roll down like water, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The long arc of the moral universe, my fellow Americans, does bend towards justice. America does change for the better, but not on its own. It took millions of Americans hundreds of years to make this country what it is today. Americans of every age and color and creed who marched and protested, who stood up and sat in. Americans who defended this democracy, this beautiful democracy, in its darkest hours. On Memorial Day in 1884, Oliver Wendell Holmes told his war-weary audience that, quote, whether one accepts from fortune her spade and will look downward and dig, or from aspiration her axe and cord and will scale the ice, the one and only success which is yours to command is to bring to your work a mighty heart. I have confidence that Americans of a different generation, our generation, will bring to our work a mighty heart to fight for what's right, to fight for the truth, and never, never lose faith. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
the United States Senate was made for moments like this. The framers predicted that factional fever might dominate House majorities from time to time. They knew the country would need a firewall to keep partisan flames from scorching our republic. So they created the Senate. Out of necessity, James Madison wrote, of some stable institution in the government. Of some stable institution in the government. Today, we will fulfill this founding purpose. We will reject this incoherent case that comes nowhere near justifying the first presidential removal in history. This partisan impeachment will end today. But I fear the threat to our institutions may not, because this episode is one of a symptom of something much deeper. In the last 3 years, the opposition to this president has come to revolve around a truly dangerous concept. Leaders in the opposite party increasingly argue that if our institutions don't produce the outcomes they like, our institutions themselves must be broken. One side has decided that defeat simply means the whole system is broken, that we literally tear up the rules and write new ones. Normally, when a party loses an election, it accepts defeat. It reflects and retools. But not this time. Within months, Secretary Clinton was suggesting her defeat was invalid. She called our president illegitimate. Former president falsely claimed that President Trump didn't actually win. He lost the election, the former president said. And members of Congress have used similar rhetoric. A disinformation campaign, weakening confidence in our democracy. The very real issue of foreign election interference was abused to fuel conspiracy theories. For years, prominent voices said there'd been a secret conspiracy between the president's campaign and a foreign government. But when the Mueller investigation and the Senate Intelligence Committee debunked that, the delegitimizing endeavor didn't stop. Didn't stop. Remember what Chairman Schiff said here on the floor. He suggested that if the American people re-elect President Trump in November, that election will be presumptively invalid as well. That's Chairman Schiff on this floor, saying if the American people re-elect President Trump this November, that election will be presumptively invalid as well. So they still don't accept the American voters' last decision. And now they're preparing to reject the voters' next decision if they don't like the outcome. Not only the last decision, but the next decision. Heads, we win. Tails, you cheated. And who can trust our democracy anyway, they say. This kind of talk creates more fear and division than our foreign adversaries could achieve in their wildest dreams. As Dr. Hill testified, our adversaries seek to divide us against each other, degrade our institutions, and destroy the faith of the American people in our democracy. And as she noted, if Americans become consumed by partisan rancor, we can easily do that work for them. The architects of this impeachment claimed they were defending norms and traditions. In reality, it was an assault on both. First, the House attacked its own precedents on fairness and due process, and by rushing to use the impeachment power as a political weapon of first resort. Then their articles attacked the office of the presidency. Then they attacked the Senate and called us treacherous. Then the far left tried to impugn the Chief Justice for remaining neutral during the trial. And now, for the final act, the Speaker of the House is trying to steal the Senate's sole power to render a verdict. The Speaker says she will just refuse to accept this acquittal. Speaker of the House says she refuses to accept this acquittal. Whatever that means. Perhaps she will tear up the verdict like she tore up the State of the Union address. So I would ask my distinguished colleagues across the aisle, is this really where you want to go? The president isn't the president. An acquittal isn't an acquittal. Attack institutions until they get their way. Even my colleagues who may not agree with this president must see the insanity of this logic. It's like saying you're so worried about a bull in a china shop that you want to bulldoze the china shop to chase it out. And here's the most troubling part. The most troubling part. There is no sign this attack on our institutions will end here. In recent months, Democratic presidential candidates and Senate leaders have toyed with killing a filibuster so the Senate could approve radical changes with less deliberation and less persuasion. Several of our colleagues sent an extraordinary brief to the Supreme Court threatening political retribution if the justices did not decide a case the way they wanted. We've seen proposals to turn the FEC, the regulator of elections and political speech, into a partisan body for the first time ever. All these things, Mr. President, all these things, a toxic temptation to stop debating policy within our great American governing traditions and instead declare a war on the traditions themselves. A war on the traditions themselves. So, colleagues, whatever policy differences we may have, we should all agree this is precisely the kind of recklessness the Senate was created to stop. The response to losing one election cannot be to attack the office of the presidency. The response to losing several elections cannot be to threaten the Electoral College. The response to losing a court case cannot be to threaten the judiciary. The response to losing a vote cannot be to threaten the Senate. We simply cannot let factional fever break our institutions. It must work the other way, as Madison and Hamilton intended. The institutions must break the fever rather than the other way around. The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. That, Mr. President, is what we will do when we end this precedent-breaking impeachment. I hope we will look back on this vote and say, this was the day the fever began to break. I hope we will not say, this was just the beginning. I ask unanimous consent the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection, the Senate stands in recess subject to the call of the chair.
The Senate will convene as a court of impeachment. If there's no objection, the journal of proceedings of the trial are approved to date. The Deputy Sergeant at Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silence on pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting for the trial of the articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. As a reminder to everyone in the chamber, as well as those in the galleries, demonstrations of approval or disapproval are prohibited.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, the Senate is now ready to vote on the articles of impeachment, and after that is done, we will adjourn the court of impeachment.
The clerk will now read the first article of impeachment.
Article 1, Abuse of Power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives, quote, shall have the sole power of impeachment, unquote, and that the President, quote, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, close quote. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his re-election, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In doing so, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. 1. President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into A, political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. 2, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within the outside of the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the President of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. 3, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine and has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Mr. Alexander, not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Mr. Burr, not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, not guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris, guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones.
Guilty.
Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King. Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Mrs. Loeffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally, not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
On this article of impeachment, 48 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 52 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment. The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
Article 2, Obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Enzi. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Guilty. Mr. Graham. Not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Ms. Harris. Guilty. Ms. Hassan. Guilty. Mr. Hawley. Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Guilty. Ms. Hirono. Guilty. Mr. Hoven. Not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Not guilty. Mr. Jones. Guilty. Mr. Kane. Guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Not guilty. Mr. King. Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Guilty. Mr. Langford. Not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Guilty. Mr. Markey. Guilty. Mr. McConnell. Not guilty. Ms. McSally. Not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Guilty. Mr. Merkley. Guilty. Mr. Moran. Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Not guilty. Mr. Murphy? Guilty. Mrs. Murray? Guilty. Mr. Paul?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Perdue? Not guilty. Mr. Peters? Guilty. Mr. Portman? Not guilty. Mr. Reed? Guilty. Mr. Risch? Not guilty. Mr. Roberts? Not guilty. Mr. Romney? Not guilty. Ms. Rosen? Guilty. Mr. Rounds? Not guilty. Mr. Rubio? Not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sass? Not guilty. Mr. Schatz? Guilty. Mr. Schumer? Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida? Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Guilty. Mr. Shelby? Not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Guilty. Ms. Smith? Guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Guilty. Mr. Sullivan? Not guilty. Mr. Tester? Guilty. Mr. Thune? Not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Not guilty. Mr. Toomey? Not guilty. Mr. Udall? Guilty. Mr. Van Hollen? Guilty. Mr. Warner? Guilty. Ms. Warren? Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Guilty. Mr. Wicker? Not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Guilty. Mr. Young? Not guilty.
On this article of impeachment, 47 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I send an order to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Before this process fully concludes, I want to very quickly acknowledge a few of the people who helped the Senate fulfill our duty these past weeks. First and foremost, I know my colleagues join me in thanking Chief Justice Roberts for presiding over the Senate trial with a clear head, steady hand, and the forbearance that this rare occasion demands. We know full well that his presence as our presiding officer came in addition to, not instead of, his day job across the street. So the Senate thanks the Chief Justice and his staff who helped him perform this unique role. Like his predecessor, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Senate will be awarding Chief Justice Roberts the Golden Gavel to commemorate his time presiding over this body. We typically award this to new senators after about 100 hours in the chair, but I think we can agree the Chief Justice has put in his due and then some. The page is delivering the gavel.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there are countless Senate professionals whose efforts were essential. I'll have more thorough thanks to offer next week to all of those teams, from the Secretary of the Senate's office to the parliamentarians, to the Sergeant at Arms team, and beyond. But there are two more groups I'd like to single out now. First, the two different classes of Senate pages who participated in this trial. Their footwork and cool under pressure literally kept the floor running. Our current class came on board right in the middle of the third presidential impeachment trial in American history and quickly found themselves hand-delivering 180 question cards from senators' desks to the dais. No pressure, right, guys? So thank you all very much for your good work. And second, the fine men and women of the Capitol Police, we know that the safety of our democracy literally rests in their hands every single day, but the heightened measures surrounding the trial meant even more hours and even more work and even more vigilance. Thank you all very much for your service to this body and to the country.
The chair recognizes the Democratic leader.
I join the Republican leader in thanking the personnel who aided the Senate over the past several weeks. Capitol Police do an outstanding job day in, day out to protect the members of this chamber, their staffs, the press, and everyone who works in and visits this Capitol. They were asked to work extra shifts and in greater numbers to provide additional security over the past 3 weeks. Thank you to every one of them. I, too, would like to thank those wonderful pages. I so much enjoyed you with your serious faces walking down right here and giving the Chief Justice our questions. As the leader noted, the new class of pages started midway in this impeachment trial. When you take a new job, you're usually given a few days to take stock of things, get up to speed. This class was given no such leeway, but they stepped right in, didn't miss a beat, ferrying hundreds of questions from U.S. senators to the Chief Justice on national television is not how most of us spend our first week at work, but they did it with aplomb. I'd also like to extend my personal thank you to David Houck, the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services, Tyler Pumphrey, the Supervisor, and Grace Ridgway, the wonderful Director of Capitol Facilities. Everyone Grace's team worked so hard to make sure we were ready for impeachment. Gary Richardson, known affectionately to us as Tiny, the Chief Chamber Attendant. Jim Hoover and the Cabinet Shop, who built new cabinets to deprive us of the use of our electronics and flip phones during the trial. Brenda Bird and her team did a spectacular job of keeping the Capitol clean, and Lyden Webb and his team who moved the furniture and then moved it again and again and again. Grace, we appreciate all your hard work. Please convey our sincerest thanks to your staff. Thank you all, the whole staff, for your diligent work through many long days and late nights during this very trying time in our nation's history.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The chair also wishes to make a very brief statement. I would like to begin by thanking the Majority Leader and the Democratic Leader for their support as I attempted to carry out ill-defined responsibilities in an unfamiliar setting. They ensured that I had the wise counsel of the Senate itself through its secretary and her legislative staff. I am especially grateful to the parliamentarian and her deputy for their unfailing patience and keen insight. I am likewise grateful to the Sergeant-at-Arms and his staff for the assistance and many courtesies that they extended during my period of required residency. And thank you all for making my presence here as comfortable as possible. As I depart the chamber, I do so with an invitation to visit the court. By long tradition and in memory of the 135 years we sat in this building, we keep the front row of the gallery in our courtroom open for members of Congress who might want to drop by to see an argument or to escape one. I also depart with sincere good wishes as we carry out our common commitment to the Constitution through the distinct roles assigned to us by that charter. You have been generous hosts, and I look forward to seeing you again under happier circumstances. The chair recognizes the Majority Leader.
I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the articles against Donald John Trump, adjourn, sine die.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned, sine die.
The presiding officer. The Deputy Sergeant at Arms will escort the House managers out of the Senate chamber.
President.
The Majority Leader.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.